All right, perfect. Or you can give me a thumbs up when we're ready. Are we good? All right, all right. Okay, I am going to call the March 1st, hard to believe it is March 1st, 2021 Planning and Programming Committee of the NVTA to order. Welcome, everyone. I just want to note we have members of the committee that are present on the meeting. We have Mayor Rochelle, Chair Wheeler, and Council Member Snyder. And I understand Mayor Meyer is not going to be able to make it today. So welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us. I hope you had a good weekend, and we're happy to be back. All right, so we are going to start with, we do have a resolution on the docket, which we need to adopt in order to allow us to meet electronically. Is there a motion to approve the resolution certifying our ability to meet electronically?
So moved.
Motion by Mayor Rochelle. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Chair Wheeler. Any further discussion on that motion? All those in favor of the resolution, please signify by saying aye.
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 Okay. Resolution carries unanimously. At this point, we do have minutes or summary notes from our November 2nd meeting, which is the last time we met. Is there a motion to approve the summary notes that have been circulated?
Motion.
Motion by Councilmember Snyder. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Chair Wheeler to approve the meeting summary from the last meeting of November. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, nay.
Aye.
The ayes have it. The meeting summary is approved. All right, so at this point, we are going to go to discussion items. The first discussion item is the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, which you have a draft that was circulated in your packet. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Jasper. He's going to tell us a little bit about what we have before us and have some discussion.
Thank you very much, Chair Wilson. Good evening, members of the committee. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce to the committee a completely new subject, although I would have to add the caveat that 2 of the 4 members present are also members of the Transportation Technology Committee. And so for Councilmember Snyder and Mayor Rochelle, this is not new information, but a new format, or not a new format, but a new setting for this discussion. So I ask for their forbearance in hearing things they've heard before, but I think it's very important that you kind of all hear this information kind of under this committee structure here, because it's very relevant to moving forward eventually to hopefully action at the authority meeting in April. So next slide, please, Shereen. Thank you. So I'm going to, first couple of slides, in fact, Councilmember Snyder and Mayor Rochelle have not seen, and this is really to set some big picture context for where this Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, or I may use the acronym TTSP, is coming from. And this really is to do with the 4th Industrial Revolution. At the bottom of this slide, you see a quote from Klaus Schwab, who I think founded the World Economic Forum and published a paper on the 4th Industrial Revolution at the tail end of 2015 and early 2016 on the 4th Industrial Revolution. And the quote there is actually really profound and relevant to the TTSP, that there has never been a time of greater promise or one of greater potential peril. And that's really where we find ourselves with transportation technology. Tremendous opportunity, but some really concerning things that we have to be cautious to mitigate or avoid completely. But just very quickly, you can see the 4 industrial revolutions laid out there, with the first enabling the mechanization of production, the second mass production, the third automated production, and then the 4th digital revolution, not just transformed production, but it's also transforming management and governance as well. And some of the characteristics, exponential increases in computing power, big data, artificial intelligence, global connectivity, and the speed of innovation and disruption. So that's kind of the backcloth. Next slide, please, Cherie. And just to illustrate this a little bit more, there's a timeline here with the Apple iPhone on the left and NVTA on the right. So firstly, looking at the left side, back in 2004, 2005, we're not exactly sure when because it's a secret, but Apple put a team of engineers together in secret to develop a computer that used a touchscreen instead of a physical keyboard or a mouse or a stylus, if you remember those BlackBerry things. And for a couple of years, they were working on this, ultimately launching the first iPhone, known at the time as the iPhone 2G for second generation, which not only was a computer, it was a phone as well, obviously. So that was in January 2007. At the time, there was not an app store as we know it today. Apple at the time wanted to preserve the integrity of the iPhone user's experience and not let third parties get access to their operating system or the phone. In the end, they relented, and 10 years later, the App Store had 2.2 million apps in it. And I think as of right now, some incredible number, like 130 billion downloads of those apps that are in the App Store. Just towards the end of last year, we saw the launch of the iPhone 12, which makes the original iPhone look like a very clunky brick, with incredibly sophisticated functionality and camera functionality as well. In a way, you might say that the iPhone follows the general principle of Moore's law, which is not really a law at all, but it's something that basically says that technology is growing exponentially. The computing power is kind of doubling every 2 years, and simultaneously the price of that computing power is plummeting every couple of years as well. So that's Moore's law for you in action. On the right hand side, NVTA, not to kind of create a negative counterfoil to Apple, but by no means do we think that way. In many ways, NVTA has been very innovative and fast moving over that same time period. But as you know, NVTA was created in July of 2002, or it started in July 2002. Transaction 2030 was adopted 4 years later, and 6 years after that, we had Transaction 2040. In October 2017, we had the current transaction update. So we're updating transaction every 5 years. And in between those last two iterations of transaction, NVTA's revenue stream began. And since then, you have allocated $2.5 billion to projects across the region. So pretty fast paced by anyone's standard of governance. But the point here really is Apple was moving exponentially, and we're putting out our long range plan every 5 years. When you look back at what Apple has done since 2007 and think about what it might do over the next 13 or 14 years, where will we be and how will we be thinking about transportation technology? So again, a bit more backcloth as to why this TTSP has been developed to position the authority to be proactive rather than constantly reactive when it comes to technology. Next slide, please. So in this presentation or overview, I'm just going to touch on four things, starting with some I call them sample Q&A. It's more like the traditional FAQs, frequently asked questions. And then we'll go through a summary of the strategies that are in the TTSP in its current draft form and the associated roles for NVTA. Without going into any great detail, we look at the technologies as they relate to the strategies. And then we'll give you some guidance on the sort of feedback that we want. It's not a long presentation, but there is a lot of new information. So we'll take a few pauses along the way to give you a chance to provide feedback rather than forcing you to wait until the end. So just by way of an introduction, before I take the first pause, the TTSP contains 8 strategies that are intended to leverage transportation technologies in support of your vision and goals for the regional transportation system in Northern Virginia. This is a really important point, is we aren't looking upon technologies as something shiny and bright to go out and purchase and play with. We're looking at this from a needs perspective and trying to understand how technologies can help or hinder the vision of the authority. So these 8 strategies focus on a range of things: mobility, accessibility, resilience, but they also embrace the core values, the 3 core values that were specifically called out. You may recall from December of last year, when the authority approved an updated vision for transaction, our long-range plan. And these 3 core values are safety, equity, and sustainability. And that's important because, you know, we're looking at these 3 core values to wrap around everything that's, you know, not just in the TTSP, but also in transaction as well. So you know, that runs through everything as far as we're concerned moving forward. And as I mentioned, there are 9 possible NVTA roles, some of which might be things that the staff could do independently, some things which would require authority action, and some other things would probably involve some collaboration with, you know, member jurisdictions, other regional partners. But the 9 roles have been identified. So Sheree, if you could scroll to the next slide, but at this stage, I'll take a pause. Chair Wilson, if you or the members have any comments at this point.
Okay, questions from the committee or comments at this point? Councilman?
So I think one of the threshold discussions that we had, and Mayor Rischel, please feel free to comment, was, do we try to chase after the technology, or do we sort of decide what we want the technology to do and then match and develop a program based upon that, funding and planning and everything else that NVTA does? So that was kind of fundamental, and I think you'll see that underscoring the presentation, because there was a lot of initial discussion, you know, the latest, well, there's this pilot test, and I think when we started this, there was a lot of talk about autonomous vehicles being out there in the tens of millions by the fall of 2020. Well, that didn't happen. So had you pegged everything on autonomous vehicles coming in the very near term, you would have just simply been wrong. But rather, we took a different approach, which is, rather than being driven by technology, we would like to, at least to some extent, lay the groundwork for what the region wants in terms of improvements. Keith, would you, and well, Mayor Rischel, would you tend to agree with that overall approach? And Keith, if you could comment on that.
Yeah, yes, Chair Snyder. Mr. Snyder is chair of the technology committee. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Also, there was discussion and sentiments expressed that we want to be certain that we do not invest in rapidly evolving technologies that are going to become obsolete. In order to make the best use of taxpayer dollars, we don't want to purchase something and then have to turn around in 18 months to 36 months and have to purchase a replacement or something new. So I would add that aspect to it. Thank you.
So let me ask a question, Mr. Jasper, kind of how this fits in, and thinking about Councilmember Snyder's comments. So is the understanding that this is an overlay for our plans, and basically shapes expectations for what we want the kind of technology building blocks to be in transportation investments that come from our member localities? Is it kind of shaping expectations, or is this designed to tee up regional investments in some of these technology components, or is the answer both?
I think it's definitely both, and it's probably more things as well. I appreciate the comments from Councilmember Snyder and Mayor Rochelle. The TTSP, by virtue of the thing that we're trying to build a strategic plan for, it is always going to be a living document. Simply because until the day that technology stops evolving, we'll need the TTSP to evolve with and hopefully just in advance of the technology. As Councilmember Snyder said, if you'd have started out thinking about this being a plan for autonomous vehicles, it clearly wouldn't. It wouldn't have worked, particularly if the assumption was by 2020 there'd be autonomous vehicles everywhere. I have to say that was never our assumption. I don't think Councilmember Snyder implied that it was, but just to double sure, that wasn't any of ever a forecast that we made. So I think the way I would suggest we think about this is what might actually happen as a result of the strategic plan in terms of how we do business at NVTA, and some of the potential impacts or outcomes of this plan will be fairly immediate from our planning perspective. As you're probably aware, we're kind of ramping up our transaction update at the moment, and part of the analytical work is going to include scenario or sensitivity analyses of which technology is likely to be a part, where we say, well, here's the future we expect based on a central point forecast, but here's some other what if scenarios. We want to understand what their impacts would be. So the TTSP will help develop the thinking for those scenario analyses that we'll be doing. There is a role, I think, at the moment that is not being filled elsewhere within the region for outreach and education related to, facing towards citizens that is needed regarding this technology. I think there's a lot of misperceptions or understandings of what the technology can and cannot do. I think looking further afield, that there may be some points where the authority feels strongly and collectively that there might be some things that you'd like to include in the annual legislative program. There may well be things that are tied to funding. Can't predict what they will be at the moment, but you certainly got the option to think about what you fund and conditions associated with what you fund. And also, looking a bit further down the road, there's the potential for the region wanting to have a kind of like a common approach to regional transportation policies that this strategic plan could help support the development of, or even the identification of before the development of. So these are some of the outcomes that we would see associated with the plan. And perhaps if you think about it in those terms, it maybe makes a bit more sense as to what we're trying to accomplish here.
I feel like that in some ways answered my questions, in some ways prompted more. But let me, I'll come back to it though. So, all right, other questions from the committee?
I'm good. We'll just proceed. I'm sure afterwards I might have some, but why don't we just keep on moving on? And
okay, all right, Jasper, back to you.
Okay, so next couple of slides, I have these kind of frequently asked questions. So how does the TTSP fit within our current primary responsibilities of planning and program? And as I've just really outlined, it fits right in very well with transaction. Because it does support our planning efforts, and transaction in its turn drives the authority's funding process. So it's all very, very closely linked. Next slide, please, Sri. There has obviously been much talk of the pandemic and how that might generate a new normal, and what does all this mean for the region's transportation system. And I think I mentioned just now that we'll be doing some scenario analysis. You may recall that last summer we did something similar, looking at potential impacts of COVID-19 on transportation, in the future. So that's already been something that you've given us authority to do, and we've presented those results to you. So our general philosophy here with respect to a new normal is that we are open-minded but cautious. We don't want to overcorrect in the absence of greater certainty, but we do hope, and it is a hope, that by summer of this year, we might be just a little bit closer in a meaningful way to getting a clearer picture. And if we are, then that all fits very comfortably within the time frame for updating transaction. So that's not a concern. Next slide, please. So kind of continuing on this theme, how do we enable or support the new transportation patterns when increasing numbers of people are working from home? Certainly, when you look at technology in general, technology has had a huge impact, and this region is one of the best in the country, probably in the top two, in its ability to have that remote work from home activity, which speaks very highly of preparedness among employers and employees with respect to IT and communications infrastructure, etc. It's not to say we all love it all the time and don't yearn to go back to some in-person contact on a more regular basis soon. But all of that has been enabled by technology, as has the rapid change in business processes for businesses to kind of pivot from bricks and mortar to click and go. So it's just kind of the catchphrase is for us now is brick or click. And we're seeing the region do a huge amount with technology to enable some level of business continue while respecting the safety precautions associated with COVID. So we see technology is really helping us through at the moment. Next slide, please. I've mentioned core values already. We've seen over the last 12 months, a great emergence of political and social concerns with respect to equity and the environment, becoming more and more a priority. And so how can transaction help or hinder there? Well, the core values are really important here, because there are some things where technology can support the core values, and maybe other areas where they actually do not. And as you'll see in a few slides down, that's something we wanted to embrace within this draft TTSP. So every one of those 8 strategies has a brief discussion on how the strategy addresses the core values. So it's very uppermost in mind from a process standpoint, the thinking about how we deal with these core values, and if you like, institutionalizing it into our planning process in a way we've never done before. The next slide, please. This is the really tough question. We looked at 4 pandemic recovery scenarios last year, and the question was, what's the greatest role of technology to enhance recovery in each of them? And I honestly don't really have a good answer for that, other than to say, any strategy that supports a willingness to travel in shared modes is going to be really important, and more broadly, all technologies rely to some extent on high quality data. Without that, without that data, the technologies are always going to be suboptimal or even ineffective. So, we've in the 8 strategies, we've given consideration to the data component as we've gone through. And so that's something I think we've learned from the pandemic and will carry forward into this plan. Next slide, please. And then some examples here of possible priorities for technology. So more demand responsive, attractive and reliable bus service. What can technology do to make that happen? Electrification of the entire vehicle fleet, be that commercial, private, trucks, cars. What can technology do to speed that and make it more cost effective? I think you'll see as you kind of dive into these strategies in a bit more detail that they do, to different extents, address both of these suggestions. It's been very much uppermost in the committee's mind that as said from the get-go, that we want the strategic plan to help the region using technologies rather than trying to find a home for the technology in the region. So it's been very much written from that perspective. So I think it's highly supportive of these suggestions. Next slide. Okay, so before I go through this slide, I'll pause again just to see if there's anything that I've said over the previous slides which has generated more questions or concerns.
Chair Wilson?
Mayor Rochelle.
A comment and a question. Regarding technology helping to support a willingness to travel in shared modes, I sense, this is just a feeling, a comment on my part, I sense a level of uncertainty that I'm not really able to gauge, depending, of course, on any new COVID variants, any new pandemics, if the public is kept in a constant state of fear over this. I'm not sure really what the future is going to bring. Let's hope that that is not the case, but I do see a certain level of uncertainty. And my question is regarding the promotion of electric fleet vehicles, for example, electric buses. My understanding is that we cannot fund replacement buses because it must, what we spend must either add capacity or reduce congestion. Is that correct? So we could not just say, for example, start replacing PRTC buses with electric buses. Is that correct?
Well, and Monica might want to chime in here as well in just a moment, so I'm going to be cautious. I think when it comes to electric buses, Mayor Wilson actually may be very well qualified to speak on the subject because the authority has funded not just electric buses, but also facilities to maintain and store those buses. But I think you're right to a certain extent that those buses really have to be expanding capacity or addressing congestion. But remember, the HB 2313, Virginia Code says that the authority must give priority to projects that achieve the greatest congestion reduction relative to cost, but it doesn't mandate that that's the only way you conduct business. So the authority has some discretion on that approach. But I would say that what's been done in Alexandria is entirely consistent with the law as it currently stands anyway.
Were they replacement or were they new, above and beyond the fleet? I'm trying to understand.
So it is part of an overall expansion of our fleet.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
We're also doing replacement activities as well, but the buses that NVTA is funding are part of the expansion of our fleet.
Expansion. Okay.
Right. And if I could, Chair Wilson and Mayor Rochelle, you are absolutely right. Our monies are for new capital investments or expanded capital investments. We're not supposed to use 2313 revenues for replacement operations or maintenance. So you're right in that it is for new capacity or expanded capacity.
Okay, thank you.
Now the 30% is a different story.
Right.
Well, and if I can, to Mayor Rochelle's first comment, 'cause it's a good one. I think even during the pandemic, I think the technology plays a role. And in fact, I literally had an example of this today where a resident emailed me referring to a new technology innovation at Metroway, which is the bus rapid transit system that Metro runs through the city for us. And they are now providing online, you can see the actual crowding on the bus before you get on. And it's designed as a COVID innovation.
Okay.
Folks know how many people are on the bus. So if they feel comfortable or not, if it's 30% full or 50% full or whatever. And I know at my day job, we've done the same thing. We provide information on bookings now to tell people whether the trains, how crowded the trains are, and give them that real-time information. Same thing. So.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions of Mr. Jasper while we pause here? Okay, let's move along.
Thank you. So you have a draft document in your packet. It is quite a substantial document, and it's not yet complete. It does not include everything that the Transportation Technology Committee has seen so far, because this is as a committee, this is your first exposure to this document, but it covers the purpose and scope of the plan. It mentions the core values and how they are addressed within the plan, the vision and goals. Certainly the vision is driven by the transaction vision that you adopted in December. Excuse the typo, NVTA roles, not tolls, is outlined, and I've mentioned earlier there are 9 possible roles that we've identified, and that's really important. We want to make this meaningful, so we don't want to reinvent any wheel. So if there are technology plans or initiatives underway that are being led by others, this plan doesn't seek to duplicate that. It actually goes the other way. It acknowledges, as the next bullet indicates, related initiatives by other regional partners. So we identify where someone's already doing something, and then we don't get in the middle of that. We perhaps will observe what's going on, but recognize that this plan shouldn't attempt to reinvent any wheels. We outline some transportation technology trends. There are a lot of citations as to what's going on. So the document is very well referenced with citations on a whole range of things you can see listed. Our strategies for NVTA, data needs, caveats and assumptions, monitoring progress and update cycle is quite important. We believe, and as I mentioned earlier, this will remain a living document forever, probably. So we don't want to kind of look towards the committees and the authority ultimately having to bless a document. We see the document as supporting material for what we really like you to be thinking about approving, which are the 8 strategies themselves. And then the other part of that is the action plan. It's great to have a strategy, but strategy is nothing if there's no implementation plan behind it. And so we've put together an action plan, which the Transportation Technology Committee has seen and will share with you at your next meeting. Again, I don't think we're looking to the committee to recommend that the authority approves the action plan. I think we're looking really that you recommend that we begin implementing the action plan, but we hold us accountable for what we do and revisit this on a regular basis over the next couple of years. So the action plan will go into that in some depth. And then as ever, we work in a world of multiple alphabets, and technology is another alphabet and language all to itself. And so we've added a glossary so that if we do drift into the jargon, which we always try and avoid, but if we do, then hopefully people will be able to use that glossary as a quick check on what we mean when we say something. Next slide, please. So at this point, if I may, Chair Wilson, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Mackenzie Love, who's been helping us put this strategy together. She's done a fantastic amount of work. She's only been with us for just over a year, maybe about 18 months now. And most of her time she's been with us, she's been working on transportation technology related work. So she's going to take a few minutes to kind of walk you through the template for each of the 8 strategies, and then explain what the strategies are and the NVTA roles, and then talk a little bit more about the strategies relate to technology. She'll keep it very high level. We're not going to get in the weeds, but I think it's important context so you can see the breadth of this and get a sense for what's included and maybe what's not included. If I may, I'll turn it over to Mackenzie now.
Ms. Love, you're up.
Thank you both. I appreciate it. I will start with giving you an overview of the structure that we use to summarize each of the 8 strategies that Keith has mentioned before. And then I'll go through and tell you what each of the 8 strategies are and get a little bit more detailed there. I just want to give you an idea of the types of things we cover for each of them. You'll see on your screen, we attempted to address these in 2 pages when possible for succinctness. We start off with the description, and that's going to be about 2 paragraphs on average, indicating what how we see the strategy unfolding. And again, that has a lot of research underpinning it. Next, we map each strategy to an NVTA goal that has already been pre-established to make sure we're consistent as we move through this process. And then we move into the NVTA roles that we see being applicable to each individual strategy. Each strategy could have up to 9 roles, but often they do have less, just depending on how the strategy is envisioned to play out. And I'll go over in depth a little bit more about what the roles are and what they could mean for NVTA in the next couple of slides. On the second page of the summaries, we talk about application of core values, and those again are safety, equity, and sustainability. And you'll see approximately a paragraph or 2 talking about how each strategy could either impact those core goals or should be viewed through the lens of those core goals. So we'll look at a couple of different ways things could play out and things that we should aim for in regards to our core values. The final portion of the summary you'll see on the far right hand of the screen there is a list of potentially applicable technologies. This is going to be very high level, kind of in a bullet point format. And the idea there is just to give everyone who's reading the plan some scope for the strategies, but not to be an exhaustive list, primarily because there's so much great innovation happening in this region, the Commonwealth and the country, quite frankly. But also it's happening at such a pace that there's no way to keep that list completely exhaustive at all times. It's just as a point of reference. So I think that's all on the summary. Shri, if you could take us to the next slide, I'll go a little bit more in depth here for you. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Shri. So this is the list of strategies and the NVTA roles. And I'll start off here by reading the strategies out to you and maybe giving you a sentence or 2 about them for your reference point. And I will pause at the end of this slide to see if you have any questions. So first, let's go through the strategies and then the roles. I should mention that the strategies are not in priority or chronological order. The numbers that you see down that left-hand column are really just reference points to help us navigate through the document and presentations like these a little bit more easily. So starting off, we have the strategy of reduce congestion, pretty consistent with NVTA overall. The next is to maximize access to jobs, employees, and housing. And that could take a variety of manifestations from physical infrastructure to things like teleworking, etc. Strategy 3 is to maximize cybersecurity and privacy for members of the public. Strategy 4 is to minimize the potential for zero occupancy vehicles. And I should pause here and say that this is primarily related to autonomous vehicles. And the way that you could get zero occupancy is if you have an autonomous vehicle drop off a passenger at a location and then completely in an autonomous mode drive to a secondary location. And so that would be hand in hand with autonomous vehicles. Strategy 5 is develop pricing mechanisms that manage travel demand and provide sustainable transportation options. And that could take a variety of manifestations as well and could be relevant to modes of transportations that are already in existence in the region. Strategy 6 is maximize the potential of physical and communication infrastructure to serve emerging and existing modes. I should stop here and say that physical infrastructure could be things like roadside units that would allow autonomous and connected vehicles to communicate with one another and their surroundings, for example, an intersection or a stoplight, so they get the situational awareness that's necessary for not only full autonomy, but also any sort of automated functioning like emergency brake systems, etc. And that might necessitate physical components. Communications networks would also be important here. You need a robust network that can relay the pieces of information in a level of consistency and speed that's necessary to make those immediate decisions that are important for autonomous vehicles, but also things like transit signal priority and data sources that are already in use throughout the region. Moving on to strategy 7, this touches on enhance regional coordination and encourage interoperability in all systems. Regional coordination could be things like policy development or infrastructure standards. And interoperability could again refer to things like transit signal priority or perhaps the data standards that are used to collect information and inform decisions about transportation throughout the region, and making sure that we can all have apples to apples comparisons and be able to use the data sources in a regionally connected way so that the travel experience is seamless for citizens as they move throughout our jurisdictions. Finally, strategy 8 talks about creating a network of charging infrastructure for use by private and fleet vehicles, and this would be for electric vehicles. And so that could take a variety of different that could be brought to fruition in a few different ways, including the charging facilities that were mentioned earlier in this call already, and could be expanded upon in the future. Going forward, we could talk about how these relate to the roles that you see on your screen. As Keith mentioned earlier, there are some roles that would be specific to the authority, some that would be specific to NVTA staff, and then some that could be shared either by the authority and staff or brought about through interaction with jurisdictions as well. For the authority, there are 3 roles we see there, and they are funding, policy, and advocating. For shared roles, those could be championing, facilitating, and serving as a stakeholder. And for staff roles, we see planning, outreach and education, and observer. I'll go through and give you one example of each of those roles, and then I'll open it up to questions and see what any comments or questions that you might have. So for funding for the authority, it might be that the authority would consider adding a scoring metric to transaction that concerns itself with the goals of the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan. It's one option of many. For championing under a shared role, it could be that either the authority members or NVTA staff would advocate for the inclusion of forward-thinking transportation and innovation measures in other plans throughout the region based on what the context and the type of interaction is. And then finally, under planning, of course, we might use we would intend to use the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan to inform the development of the next iteration of transaction, as Keith spoke about earlier. Finally, I just want to point out that there is an observer role, and you'll see there's only one check mark in that column. But the intention around this is transportation technology and innovation around it evolves so rapidly that there are some cases we may not have a tangible role just yet, but we need to make sure that we are stay up to date on all of the developments and can react and pivot quickly if the need arises. So we do want to make sure to observe things that are happening in the field, the region, the state, and the nation. I'll pause here and see if you all have any questions.
Okay, any questions for Ms. Loeb?
Yeah, I have one. Just sort of thinking about it, really sort of number 7 got me thinking about it, about interoperability among the jurisdictions. I mean, I'm assuming that at the same time we'd be monitoring sort of federal standards and guidelines in all those areas, because really that's, I mean, eventually that's sort of where a lot of the interoperability is going to come from, with federal standards. And I would hate to get out in front of that per se, depending on what, was coming, and almost advocate for the federal, government to come down and set some of these things, so there is more interoperability across, entire states. Is there any, is any of that happening at the federal level?
Chair Willer, if I may answer in 2 parts here. The first is that we do look to, in the related initiative section of the draft plan, we do include some federal initiatives. So we are monitoring those actively now. And at the state level also, as they might set some standards that would impact efforts towards interoperability at the regional level. We also mentioned the potential to advocate for some federal standards or state standards in some of the policy roles that you see on the screen there. And it would be dependent on the priorities of the NVTA at the time and how they could be incorporated into any legislative programs. Stop and see if Keith has anything to add to this one.
Not much, but one additional example I would give, that there's a couple of ways that the region, the greater DC region, goes about doing transit signal priority. But there may be a preferred way of doing it, or there may be another way of doing it. So as always, the greatest benefit of technology is really when it's applied across the greatest kind of geographic and functional footprint. And what within this plan we want to try and avoid is a patchwork of approaches, which means that nowhere reaches the most optimal efficiency levels, and also where, for example, the authority may be funding technology projects in one jurisdiction, and then in another jurisdiction we're funding something that's kind of, if not in conflict, it's certainly not complementary either. So recognizing bus routes go through multiple jurisdictions, it doesn't make sense to have different approaches to transit signal priority across jurisdictional boundaries.
And my only other kind of sort of question, comment, is there a discussion about the fact of the need to sort of change in midstream if a technology sort of goes away or is determined not to be working? The example I'm thinking of is the lane signals on 66 that were put in. We won't get into this discussion about those, but about how they were supposed to help traffic flow, and somehow it all got scrapped. And I don't know whether it worked or not. And I apologize if someone designed it who's sitting on this call, but just the idea that sometimes technologies are rapidly changing and how we sort of address that when we're halfway through a project or something that we're implementing. I mean, that's a real risk. I think you recognize that up front.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly recognized that there is a risk of becoming, a victim, as it were, of the rapid evolution of technology and investing in a particular technology, which is then superseded by another. Our crystal ball isn't perfect like anyone else's, but I think the more we think about it as a region, and we don't claim to have the monopoly on this at all. I mean, we would work with you and our regional partners on this. Sometimes technologies do work for long enough that it justifies the expense of doing it, even if it's then essentially decommissioned after a period of time. And VDOT is, I think it's fair to say, thinking about whether it wants to kind of mount very significant overhead gantries with digital messages on at a time when the rest of the world is moving to apps on phones. Not that apps on phones in cars are a good combination, but the technology exists for apps to talk to drivers without the drivers having to interact with the device. So, these things are in a constant state of change, and I think we recognise the risks, but nothing is perfect either. But I think at least if we're taking a long-term view of these things, we're more likely to avoid redundancy than if we, just let technology happen to us.
Okay, other questions? All right, back to Ms. Love.
Thank you, Chair Wilson. And Sri, if you could take us to the next slide, please. Thank you. This is a table to show you an overview of the types of technologies that we've considered in the plan. And I know that text is quite small there, so I'll go over them in just a moment. But I wanted to point out here, again, that there are so many types of technologies and the speed of innovation is so great that we have collapsed some of the individual items into larger groupings here that you'll see across the top of your screen. We have then tried to map them back to the strategies proposed in the TTSP and evaluate, do we think that this group of technologies has the most potential to be helpful? Do we think that it has a potential to be detrimental, or maybe a potential to be either or both? And that varies with the types of technologies and the strategy that we're pursuing. So you can see across the top here, we've looked at automated and autonomous vehicles, and that has to do with the level of driving that they can either facilitate for a driver or that they can take on themselves. And that's a nuanced difference and somewhat of a continuum as you move through the technology. We've also looked at shared mobility devices, often referred to as SMDs. Also signal technologies, apps, meaning mobile apps on your phone, system optimization, drones, changes to delivery and freight system, surveillance and monitoring, data generation and improvements to mass transit, and smart technologies, or the Internet of Things is that last acronym there. I will give a couple of examples from this table to illustrate how we did this mapping, and then open it back up for questions to see if you have any thoughts on technologies or how we've related them in the TTSP itself. First, I want to start off with this upper left-hand corner here about autonomous vehicles, and you'll see that the icon there indicates that there is a potential to be helpful and a potential to be detrimental. What does that mean? Autonomous vehicles could be helpful if they are used in perhaps a shared manner to move more individuals with one vehicle, even if it's one person at a time, or if we can get to shared occupancy. And their ability to drive themselves may allow for optimization of the network, because they could get increased information from their surroundings and change routes if need be to react to congestion or some other issue. So in that way, they could also potentially move more closely together due to their reaction times, and also help reduce congestion in that way. So all of those have the potential to be quite helpful to our network. But there's also the potential, as I mentioned earlier, to have zero occupancy vehicles after an autonomous vehicle has dropped off a passenger. That could increase congestion, especially if they're circling the block to look for parking. So there are definitely two possibilities there, and it's something that planning proactively can help us address and try to obtain the benefits while mitigating the negatives, which is the objective of the TTSP. I think I'll pause there and see if you have any questions about anything displayed here.
Okay,
I
question.
do have a question. I do have a question. I'm sorry. If you assign number values to all these, like, you know, the from positive to negative, obviously with a detrimental one being more of a negative, is there any way to rank these and just sort it?
That's an interesting question. I'm sorry, it's taking me a moment to think through it. I think that with many of these technologies and the strategies themselves, there's so much nuance and complication and difference in use cases. For example, some of these are interdependent. You would need the data generation and collection and sharing group of technologies there to empower, for example, system optimization, autonomous vehicles, changes to freight and delivery. So it becomes a very complicated interaction. And some of them are more independent, but some of them build on one another also. For example, advances made in signal technologies might inform how we optimize our system as a whole. I think because of these complexities and the different use cases, particularly how they apply to different modes of transportation, it would be quite hard to rank them on a spectrum or to rate them in that manner. But I'm certainly open to suggestions if that's something that would be useful, or if there are any suggestions how to go about ranking them.
You know, for me, it was just, I looked at them like, okay, well, which are the ones you should do first and which are their priorities? And I see all the ones with the dark red, you know, the dark folding bullets. I'm like, okay, you start there. But what I hear you saying is that they're interdependent, so you can't really do that. I'm fine. We can move on. We're good.
Okay, other questions for Ms. Lowe?
Chair Wilson, if I may add one more thing in response to Chair Wheeler, in the we do look into those types of how do we address this over time once we get into the action plan that is forthcoming. So we will give some more thought as to what needs to be done first in those next stages of the plan.
Great. Okay. I think no other questions for now, so let's move along. Great.
I'll jump back in here if I think this is the last slide other than the thank you slide. So just to give you some guidance as to the sorts of feedback we're looking for from the committee. Obviously the first one there, any additional thoughts you have, you've been very engaged with us throughout and we've been taking good notes. So that's all very helpful. But if there are any other kind of closing thoughts that you have, yeah, either now or over the coming days, what we don't necessarily expect you or want you to do even is to read the documents. Your staff have seen earlier iterations of this and provided feedback that has been addressed within the current version that you're seeing here, and so be assured that we don't expect you to plow through a 60-odd page document. But if there are things which kind of jump to mind about things perhaps that you haven't heard or would like to check to see whether they are addressed in the document, I mean, those sorts of thoughts will be great. You don't need to read the document to have those sorts of comments or questions. We will be very interested to hear if there are any other organizations that you think that the TTSP would benefit from another perspective. So if there are any such organizations, then we'd be happy to entertain those. We are obviously working through all of NVTA's committees first, but so that's something we'll put out there. As both Mackenzie and I have mentioned, there are many other initiatives underway that are referenced in the document. If there's something you want to double check that we're aware of, then please feel free to raise that, and we'll take a look and let you know whether it's included, or if not, we'll include it. Looking a little bit further ahead, we're not going through a formal public comment process at the moment for this, but in large part because under transaction, we're going to be doing public engagement on a broad range of topics. And we think that's probably the best vehicle to do public engagement. So that'll be coming up in the spring. But any thoughts you have from your past experience about how we get the right balance of content and words, graphics, and so on for a public-facing version of the plan, that would be really helpful for us to hear, and especially if you've got any examples that you can share of low-cost visualizations in particular. We've set a somewhat arbitrary deadline for your feedback 2 weeks from now. If that's not sufficient, then please let us know and we'll extend that. But that within that time frame, we can absorb what you say and incorporate it into what will be a near final draft at your next meeting for final review and feedback. So we'll share that with you prior to your next meeting, which I believe is on March 25th. So that's all we have. Thank you very much for your attention. And Chair Wilson, hand back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Jasper, for the presentation. It would have been good to know that I wasn't expected to read it late last night. That would have been helpful, but it's all good. Is there additional feedback? I think for me personally, I think I understand the plan itself. I think the part that I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head around, and perhaps I'm not going to be able to at this stage, is understanding how it is actualized, how it impacts the work that we do. And I think some of that is probably still to be fleshed out, and some of that is just I need to experience to understand. I think as far as to the extent you guys are working with our staffs, which I know you are, I think that's obviously vitally important, as they'll end up being the user base. I also feel like each of us probably have some form of local policy committees that are involved in transportation planning. I know we do, and I'm sure others do as well. It seems like as we go forward, socializing this to them and getting feedback from those avenues as well could be helpful. But all in all, I think this is absolutely the right thing to do. I kind of want to understand at some point, how it all gets implemented. So, other feedback?
Yeah, Chair Wilson.
Is that Mayor Rochelle? Mayor Rochelle, there you are.
Yes, thank you. Just as a very general, broad comment, and I speak both as a TTC member and a PPC member, I think it's really helpful if we maintain a flexibility in our expectations of how this is going to unfold. And I think a great example is related to Chair Wilson's example of how technology is used to make riders aware of how many folks are on the bus. It may be a while before we can use that technology the way it's really intended to be used. The end goal is to maximize ridership on the buses, but obviously we won't be packing them in anytime soon. So if we can just be flexible in our expectations, that's going to help a lot. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mayor Rochelle. Other comments?
Sure. Mayor Wilson, I think your opening questions and then your comment at the end suggests that we need to put this in a perspective of this is sort of a template plan. You got to start somewhere, and technology can't any longer be something we think about every now and then, and it sort of ends up at the end of the decision-making process. But it's so complicated and so constantly moving, you need some way to understand. And then the action plan will, I think, answer some of your questions about, okay, now what happens next? And I think it answers to some extent Chair Wheeler's question, another very good one, which is, okay, I'm looking at this, now what do I do with it? And that wasn't what you said, but it's what are the priorities and how do I move out? And that's probably then like another step down the road. And then I think going back to Mayor Wilson's question about how does this relate to the other planning documents that we have? I think those are all fundamental questions which, as we present this again, I think we need to put it in that context. What is this thing? What's next? And how ultimately is our thought about how it could be used, maybe, or questions that I've heard people ask tonight that I think would improve overall the presentation. But I look at it as fundamentally moving technology from a very marginal consideration to a much more, a much higher, more visible consideration in achieving the objectives that NVTA generally has. So.
Okay. Other comments? All right. Well, that concludes that. We thank you, Mr. Jasper, for the presentation, and Ms. Love for the presentation and all the work to get us to this place. It sounds like we have a lot more discussion ahead, but this is, I think, as Councilmember Snyder said, this is definitely a template and for how we do this. All right. Next up, back to Mr. Jasper for the transaction update.
I'll be very quick here, but I just wanted to give Ms. Backman an opportunity to actually speak to this item regarding the procurement for transaction. If not, I can take it.
Well, no, thank you, Keith. And for the members of the committee, you will see on your authority agenda next week when we do the packet dispatch for this week, we are, and we did vet this with the Finance Committee, we are recommending Cambridge Systematics that the authority enters into agreement, a contract award with Cambridge Systematics. We had a committee of 9 jurisdiction staff members and 1 authority member who voted, and it was an 8-to-1 vote. It wasn't a lot of dissension, but because of the procurement laws, we did meet with the, I guess, the highest 2 scoring teams, and the final recommendation was to proceed with Cambridge Systematics. Now, I will note on your agenda for the authority meeting next week, you will see the transaction contract award update and the 6-year program. Because as you may recall, the modeling component is tied to the 6-year program. So we'll get into a deeper dive discussion in regards to that. But at this time, we anticipate issuing a call for projects for the 6-year program update in the summer. Cambridge Systematics will be running the model, but we, assuming the authority approves the contract award, but we will have to do some validation of that model because it's a different model than we currently use. But we are still looking to keep our 6-year program update as a biannual update and keeping, giving ourselves some flexibility, but keeping that process. Are there any questions?
Any questions for Ms. Backman?
Yes. What form does the validation take? Is it similar to the bond validation prior?
Oh, no, and Keith, please help me out because it's really a technical validation, making sure that the model works for all of the projects, that the inputs and outputs aren't skewed or anything like that. We did validation of the model when we were doing transims, and I don't know, for those time we the HB 599 process under transims, we didn't do a transit because the law was worded in the way that transit wasn't included. But when we started to include transit in the HB 599 process, we did validate the model, making sure the results, the outputs were comparable. So this is really what we're talking about, Mayor Rischel. It's a technical, I guess, analysis or evaluation of the model to validate the inputs and the outputs, making sure that there are no errors that will skew the results.
Okay, it's sort of like if you're in a chemistry lab, you would run a standard deviation to see how it deviates from the standard curve. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Other questions for Ms. Backman on transaction? Okay. Ms. Backman, we want to go back to you for the NVTA update.
Sure, I will be brief. Our very own Mayor Wilson is on the agenda to brief the authority on the progress of the Potomac Yard Metro Rail Station. One of the reasons I asked Mayor Wilson to provide an update, number one, the project is moving quickly, I will note, and the authority, we've reached our funding commitment for the project. The authority funded the project at $69.5 million. I think we reimbursed the final invoice a few weeks ago, so thank you. We like to see that money moving. Mayor Wilson did send some pictures of it, and it looks drastically different from when we did the groundbreaking in December of 2019. So I did ask him if he could provide an update to the authority. Also, going along with that, we do have a member of JBG Smith, Jay Cabalas, that's talking about the transportation infrastructure investments in the National Landing area. So I think that will make for a very interesting discussion. That's all I have.
Looking forward to it. Now that you guys have reimbursed us, I can tell you guys what I really feel. So, now that we're done. So I want to make sure our finance people told me the check cleared. So now let me give you a piece of my mind. No, it's all good. No, we very much appreciate the generosity of NVTA on this project. This is, as we'll talk about next week, this is a transformational project for the city, and something we have spent really, it's not over dramatizing to say, it's something we've spent a quarter of a century planning and preparing for. So we're excited. Only a year left now, which is pretty amazing. So, all right. Anything else, Ms. Backman, on the NVTA update?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick question for Ms. Backman, and let me recognize her leadership in creating the whole technology work. It was really her leadership and great staff work that has brought us to this point. So I wanted to point that out. There's going to be movement on federal infrastructure legislation, and I really, I think if we can influence it, it's pretty soon that we've got that opportunity, and people are probably already doing it in one way or another, but it would be if we weren't working at cross purposes. You know, what is it reasonable and would be most beneficial to our public in an infrastructure package at the federal level?
Thank you for that question, Mrs. Snyder. I guess it was last week, I participated in a transportation roundtable that Senator Warner's office held, or Senator Warner held, I should note. And one of the questions he asked, because he said, you know, we have another infrastructure bill coming forward, he challenged us to think out the box, think creatively, and just think out the box regarding the need of not only Northern Virginia, but Virginia as a whole. So I did mention the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan, because just looking at where the federal government is going, even the General Assembly with some of their bills on electrification and things of that, we do want to try to share with the Senator's office some of the things we're noting in the Transportation Technology Strategic Plan. For me, as your executive director, it's very important that the authority be on the leading edge instead of behind the curve, because worst case scenario, and this gets to something that Chair Wheeler stated earlier, if we're funding things that do not reach their useful life, that creates whole different conversations just because of the legal agreements we have with the project sponsor. So we want to make sure that we are on the cusp, but that we're thinking ahead, we're thinking out of the box, we're thinking creatively, but still meeting our goals. So to answer your question, Mrs. Snyder, we are working with Senator Warner's office. We also have someone from Congressman Connolly's office participating in the ITS roundtable next week. We told them that we would do a follow-up, because we do want to share, you know, where we think as the sub-regional MPO, if you will, some of the needs are for Northern Virginia regarding transportation infrastructure investment.
Okay.
Yeah, you know, we actually, Councilmember Steiner, were you on the NVRC call today, or no?
I was not, no.
Yeah, we had both senators on there today, and we actually had a fair amount of dialogue on this issue. today. I can speak just for Alexander. We sent a letter a couple weeks ago to Congressman Byer and both senators, basically with our laundry list of infrastructure things, trying to just give them an idea of the things that we would prioritize. I think I heard, and Chair Wheeler can probably, and Mayor Rochelle can probably either affirm or reject my contention, but I think I heard a little bit of pessimism today from certainly Senator Warner, left or so to Senator Kane about the prospects of certainly a hasty infrastructure bill. But even I think Senator Warner, the message I took today was that the Recovery Act may be the infrastructure bill for a little while, but we'll see. So.
One was more optimistic than the other, but I think there was a sort of trying to temper the expectations at this point in time regarding a huge infrastructure bill that everybody's been talking about. So, but it did sound eventually it might come to fruition, but not right on back of a recovery bill, I don't think.
Yeah, that was the message I took from today's call. So, but we'll see. But I think you're right that everyone should be preparing for it. To be ready to both populate a project list, but then also figure out how to make it happen if it does happen. So,
and oh, I'm sorry. One more thing, I did mention the ITS Transportation Roundtable. If I know a few of you on the WebEx this evening have registered, if you would like to register, please let us know. We are reserving some slots for authority members if you would like to register. So thank you.
Okay. Other questions for Ms. Backman? Okay. So before we adjourn, we have our next meeting is the 25th. Now, is that 5 p.m. as well? Is that the plan?
That's the suggested one. We haven't finalized. I wanted to make sure that you are all available for that time. Yes, 5 p.m. on March 25th.
I can do 5. I just can't do later. So I can do 5 that night. So does that work for everyone else? I see a thumbs up. I see a nod. I don't see Mayor Rochelle on my screen at all. Let me see where you are. There you are. Is that good, Mayor Rochelle? Does that work for you? Can't hear you.
I'm sorry. March 25th, that's a Thursday?
Thursday, and we were thinking 5 p.m.
Yes.
Okay, yes, thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, very good. All right. Anything else we need to talk about here? Okay, I will see you all on the 11th. Which,
Thank you.
As we were discussing earlier, is my birthday, so please come prepared.
Oh, happy birthday.
I want anyone to not have that on their calendar already. So.
Okay.
All right. See y'all. Have a great night.
Bye.